with destiny, and now the time comes when we shall redeem our pledge, not only or in full measure, but very substantially. At the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom.
Hello, everyone. We have with us Professor Mridula Mukherjee, former director of Nehru Memorial and Museum Library. We would be talking about Nehru, our first Prime Minister, his legacy, and we would try to understand what Nehru really was, because as we know, 75 years from the independence, it seems that we don't really know him that well. There are various perceptions about Nehru's, but it seems that we have to go back to learning him again. So that this is one of those efforts. Good evening, ma'am. Thank you for speaking to National Herald.
Welcome.
I will start with our first question. Like I said, that we are going to celebrate 75 years of independence. As a historian, of the modern contemporary times, how do you think Nehru should be remembered by the nation from here on?
Well, clearly there are two very clear, very distinct aspects to how we would have to remember Nehru. First, he would have to be remembered as a foremost freedom fighter. He was one of the tallest leaders of our freedom struggle. After Gandhiji, it is usually Jawaharlal Nehru's name that we take as among the most prominent leaders. That doesn't mean that there were not other very prominent leaders like Sardar Patel, Rajendra Prasad, Maulana Azad, Kripalani of the later phase. But if we go back, then begin with Dadabhai Naoroji and Gopal Krishna Gokhale and Tilak. I mean, we had so many stalwarts that it is difficult to say who were primary. But I would certainly say that among those front rank of the leaders of the freedom struggle, Jawaharlal Nehru was certainly one. And since he played a very crucial role in the final phase, the mass phase of the freedom struggle under the leadership of Gandhiji from 1918-19 till 1947, those last 30 years. Therefore, obviously, in more recent history, his name would be coming up as among the foremost ones, right? Secondly, we have to remember him as the founder of the independent Indian state, the founder, the builder, the architect of India after independence. He was prime minister for a long time, He was prime minister for almost 17 years. And that's a long time at a very crucial period in India's history, just after becoming independent. In fact, even from a year before, he was heading the interim government, which was equal to the role of prime minister. Once Gandhiji died in January 1948, which was, just about 5 months after we got our independence, then Nehru's role becomes even more important. In another 3 years, Sardar Patel left us in 1950. And certainly he was a great support to Nehru and a co-builder of India after independence. Once he left, then Nehru's responsibility in a sense and his role becomes even larger in terms of being able to carry forward.
And in a way, he was also more alone in this endeavor.
Yes, that's why I said the responsibility on him became even, more heavier. Of course, Maulana Azad luckily was still there for another few years till about 58. And and he had a very able cabinet. There's no doubt about that, because we had extraordinary talent that came to build India after independence. Partly they were all people who had come in through the freedom struggle. People like Govind Ballabh Pant, for example, who was in the cabinet at the center for a very long time. People of that kind of stature, extraordinary intellectual, by the way. And people of extra, and also Nehru pulled in a lot of professional talent into the cabinet. So it was. He also he was not at all sectarian when it came to running the government. He brought in the best talent from wherever he thought. C.D. Deshmukh, for example, was a former ICS. John Mathai, the economist, finance minister after independence, he wasn't a freedom fighter. There were many people who came from different walks of life and contributed.
So domain experts he got.
Yes. So I would therefore, to summarize, we have to remember him as a freedom fighter, because often we forget that. People, I find, always talking about Prime Minister Nehru. During his prime ministership, he did that. Before that, for 30 years, he was mobilizing, he was out in the fields, he was out on the streets, he was out on the mohallas. For 9 years, he was in jail. Out of those 30 years that I'm talking about, for 9 years, he spent in jail.
9 years?
9 years, yes. He went to jail 9 or 10 times, and a total of 9 years was spent in jail. That's why he could write 3 brilliant books.
This is something definitely the modern generation do not understand and do not know, because there is so much of misinformation also spread. And we will talk about the misinformation later. But to summarize your point, he was a freedom fighter to begin with. And you're saying for 30 years, he has been a freedom fighter before he got to the power of the prime minister. Somehow it seems that everything was served to him on a platter, and he got everything easy. Somehow that is the impression. So we have to remember that. And then you said that he was the architect of modern India, the India as we know it today, or shall we say the India that we know by 2000s, by the 21st century. He was the architect. And that would bring me to my next question is, what do you think was the vision that he had for India? What was his core values and his dreams for India that he wanted to, he wanted to take India to that level at international stage? We were a poor country. We were a country that was viewed as backward and a land of snake charmers, and that kind of an image that Rajas and Maharajas walk about in elephants. That's all that the world knew about us. So what was the architect's dream for the India that he wanted to build, that he implemented in the next 17 years? So if you could give us about that vision, that dream, that value system.
Firstly, let me correct that impression, which has become popular later on, that, in the world thought of India as a land of snake charmers and all that. The world, when India was fighting for freedom, the world also saw India as one of the most prominent fighters for freedom in the world. In fact, it was understood that India was the leader of the colonial world against colonial oppression. And Indian freedom, Indian independence was understood to be the turning point for the end of colonialism in the whole world. So India was seen by Africa, by Southeast Asia, by other colonial countries as being the leader of the whole wave of anti-imperialist struggles for freedom. It was people would look up to India and say, what's happening here? When is India becoming independent? And it is true, India was the first country to gain independence from British colonial rule or any big colonial rule. And it is after that, from the 40s into the 50s and into the 60s, that the rest of Asia and Africa started to become slowly throw off the foreign yoke.
Right.
Okay. India's struggle for freedom was the first struggle to start.
I see.
Right in the third quarter of the 19th century. Intellectually also, the whole intellectual contribution of the Indian leadership, from Dadabhai Naoroji to Gokhale to Tilak, the whole first generation, of thinkers, Rana Day, R.C. Dutt, they were the ones who laid down the framework for understanding what is modern colonialism.
I see.
And it is on that basis that the struggle for freedom started in India. And then from India, you could say a lot of the ideas began to spread. Of course, there were other forces also in the world. I'm not saying that every country was imitating India or getting all their resources from India, but India was certainly in the forefront. In most other countries, even in China, for example, if you look at when their modern struggle for democracy and freedom from the different kinds of colonial powers which they had, you have to wait for another 30, 40 years, for that to begin in the second decade, Sun Yat-sen and all that, second decade of the 20th century. In India, Dadabhai Naoroji's ideas, for example, we are talking about the 1870s. And in fact, more recent research has shown that in Maharashtra, even before the revolt of 1857, in the 1840s itself, some of these new ideas about understanding the true nature of colonial rule had already come out.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah. Yeah.
So for Jawaharlal Nehru,
his vision,
it was not that he had to establish India, in the world. India was the leader of the colonial world already.
Right.
Indian publicists had spread this in the US, for example. Lala Lajpat Rai had gone for a tour in the second decade.
Right.
And spread these ideas. So many publicists used to go, leaders used to go, messages, people used to read books about India and all that. So I would say in the aware part of the world, the politically conscious part of the world, India also had that image. Gandhi was very well known, so it was not only an image of snake charmers and this thing. All right. Yes, India did become independent as a very poor country. 200 or more years ravaged by colonialism. From a very rich country, we had become a very poor country.
Right.
So yes, Jawaharlal Nehru had his work cut out for him. And the other thing was that as far as what his dream was, what his vision was, the first question you asked was in the world. Now, I think Jawaharlal Nehru was very clear that just because you were poor didn't mean that you were not wise,
right,
or that you did not have anything to offer to the world in terms of a vision. So he never thought that India's poverty or its being an underdeveloped country in any way was a constraint in being able to express India's ideas to the world. In fact, some people do criticize also and say, big talk, but without substance. But that's not how it was seen. India, even in the late 40s and early 50s, you would be surprised to see, played the role of peacekeeper in the world. It was very active in the UN forces that were sent anywhere. India played a role in negotiations between the big powers in Korea, in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam. So India was playing a role in international diplomacy which it is not playing today, despite the fact that we are now so much more powerful, so much richer. So I think this notion that, if you become a developed country necessarily, or more developed, necessarily your voice will count for more. No, it's a question of how you play the role and what role you play. Are you playing a role even? For
Right.
example, today the Israel-Palestine conflict is going on.
Yeah,
India is silent.
silent.
Why? I cannot imagine such a thing happening if Nehru was around. India had a voice. It had an opinion despite
Right.
being poor.
So
And
you're saying it had a
used
thought.
to
India
say,
was
our
already a
people may be poor. Even the poorest of our people are very wise.
wise.
Wisdom and wealth do not necessarily go together.
Right. So you're saying India was already a Vishwa Guru in that sense. We're already a
Yes,
thought
but
leader.
we did not have, no, it was not Vishwa Guru.
Okay.
We thought of ourselves as equal to everybody else.
Equal.
We didn't think ourselves as superior.
Right.
Jawaharlal Nehru would be the last person
Amazing.
to want to be superior. Why? Every country has the right to their own dignity, their own position in the world. We want to be equal. We don't want to talk down to people, but we are certainly willing to give advice and play a role where we can. And
That's it.
certainly, he thought India had something to offer to the world, its ancient wisdom, its whole history, its rich experience as a people, as a state. After all, state formation in India took place, very, very early on. So if we have such a rich history, obviously we have something to offer to the world. But that doesn't mean it is superior to others.
Right. No, that's a very beautiful way of putting it, that there is no need to be Vishwa Guru, but we were equals.
Yes,
And
yes.
you're saying that
Why? Everybody in the world wants to, live the life their own way, their own culture, their own way. Who are we to tell the world how to live? The
how?
Chinese have an old civilization.
Absolutely.
Egypt has an old civilization. Mesopotamia, Iraq, all these places had civilizations which are as old as Indian. Greek civilization, why, even in terms of, you're just talking in terms of antiquity, how does India become superior? I don't understand this obsession with wanting to be superior, wanting to be older than everybody. We are old enough.
Yeah.
It's okay. It's quite enough.
So, like you just said, that today's situation with Palestine and Israel, and we are quiet, we don't have a voice. What are these values that we have lost over the time, that you would think that
Yeah.
Nehru's cherished values that we probably
One
have lost?
standing up for the oppressed, standing up for the underdog. So in international relations, India's voice would always be with those who were being oppressed. Let me give you an example. South Africa. Why does South Africa even today have such regard for India? Because at a time when nobody was willing to support the struggle of the Black people in South Africa, nobody was willing to condemn South Africa. India did. India did it when it had no power. It was a poor country. But India did it right in the 40s and 50s. India stood with South Africa from then on. So it's a question of moral stand.
Moral stand.
That was from Gandhi. Nehru was a Gandhian in that way. He believed very much in a moral position, whether it was in India or it was in the world. So I think that was very important. Then the belief in non-violence, the belief in peace, that the objective of world diplomacy has to be peace. The message coming out of the two world wars which had devastated the world. Don't forget, when India becomes independent, the Second World War has just ended. Yeah. The world is just still recovering. Think of Europe at that time. Europe is devastated. Millions have died. Millions. 20 million died in the Soviet Union. Just remember that, in one country. And the Marshall Plan had to be put in place in order to rebuild Europe. They were rationing still going on in Britain, not enough food to eat, no? So when that was the stage,
That was
and so the objective of the new arrangements which he hoped the world would now move towards under the aegis of the United Nations and all that, in which he hoped that India would play a big role, and he was always at the forefront to play a big role, would be the objective would be world peace. So he put, again following Gandhi, when the atom bomb was thrown, Gandhiji's reaction was that I am even more convinced that the world needs non-violence. Atom bomb has not convinced me of the necessity of violence. It has convinced me of the opposite.
Right.
And Nehru made that his mission in life, to work for peace, world peace.
World peace.
Yeah. So that there, India's voice was always there for world peace, to bring about negotiated settlements between countries, to try and reduce conflict, to support the colonial countries in their struggles for freedom. That is how the whole idea of non-alignment comes about.
Exactly. Right.
Unhappily for Nehru, the world got divided into two blocks after the end of the Second World War. The Soviet-led bloc and the US-led bloc, or the Western-led bloc. And Nehru was very clear that India was not going to become a junior partner or a cog in some bloc. We had not become independent to now become subservient again.
Exactly.
So we wanted our own voice. And that is why the concept of non-alignment. And as you know, you're aware of how that idea grew over time. It took time. But and more people came round to it. Initially, it was Nasser in Egypt and Yugoslavia, Tito, Marshal Tito.
Yeah.
These were the two big supporters. But Indonesia, Ceylon, various places, meetings were held, conferences were held, and finally a non-aligned
movement
was set up in 61 in Belgrade. And that was and it is an idea which has lasted.
Yes, absolutely.
And more countries, as they came out of the colonial yoke, joined non-aligned bloc, because they all had the same imperative as India, the same feeling. We have not become independent to become subservient again.
To one big brother. We didn't want to become subservient to either of the big brothers. So we wanted to have our independent voice in the world.
Right.
And that's why
it took a while for people to appreciate it. I mean, initially, even, of course, the US didn't like it at all.
Yeah. I think it is also incredibly brave of smaller nations to decide to stay independent of either of the factions, either of the blocks.
But the fact that you could now form a third bloc, which was the non-aligned bloc.
Non-aligned bloc.
It was a bloc, but a non-aligned bloc.
Very.
That was a very interesting concept.
And it has
many countries joined, and of course, Indira Gandhi took it forward.
Yeah, and it has survived till date.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. So you're saying you're saying this is one of the values that we have lost, that we are no longer being that speaking for the oppressed.
Yes,
and
we are. It seems to me that we do not have such a clear-cut voice in world affairs.
Diplomacy, world
diplomacy. Yeah.
Okay.
And India's like, as I said, it was looked up to as somebody who would take a moral position. I think that has somewhere
that kind of has been
right. We have tended to move closer to certain countries more than necessary. No.
Right.
And thereby, I think, sacrifice some of our independence. Though I think the basic thrust of Indian foreign policy, I think the non-aligned thrust is still strong enough for us not to become totally aligned with any bloc. No, because there is a certain structural reason why we are non-aligned.
Right.
But I think it has weakened. That impulse has weakened. and
Right.
that's not a good thing. And our ability to speak up in the world has weakened.
Okay. So we'll come back to that again. But let's talk about the 17 years that Nehru was the prime
Yes.
minister.
We laid a tryst with destiny, and now the time comes.
Let's talk about the 17 years that Nehru was the prime
Yes.
minister. It was, I mean, in my, I think it was one of the most productive years. We have a newly independent country facing many odds, and then we still had laid the foundation of a, robust engineering, steel, electric and atomic energy, space research, industrial sector. We have the IITs, IIMs. So, I mean, pretty much the aims, pretty much all of that was required for the solid foundation of a country was built within those 17 years. In your knowledge, would you say any other period of any other prime minister has been as productive as Nehru's 17 years? Would you be able to
Well,
compare, even if
you are asking,
even if vaguely? I understand it's not easy, but
no, I would say, no, without doubt, I think those were very crucial years. I think the fact that very strong and clear-cut foundations were laid during those first almost 2 decades is what has stood us in very good stead in the long run. I mean, let us take, for example, the decision that we must have investment in heavy industry. Most people at various stages, not most people, many people at various stages have argued that India followed a wrong policy. It should have gone in for a policy of industrialization based on intermediate industry, small industry and intermediate industry, because after all, heavy industry takes in a lot of investment. It cannot provide that kind of employment as smaller and medium industry can. However, Nehru's understanding, and this understanding was shared by, it was a consensus at that time by industry leaders, by economists, by his cabinet colleagues. It was not something only personal to him, was that if for securing our economic independence, and without economic independence in the long run, there will be no political independence. So to secure our economic independence, it is necessary to invest in heavy industry. Because without that, you will always be dependent on other countries for your basic machinery supplies. After all, what is industry? In factories are set up, you buy machines to produce goods. But what about the factories that produce the machines?
Right.
Heavy industry is what? Steel.
Right.
Now, if you don't have steel, how are you going to manufacture machines?
So your intermediaries are dependent upon your heavy
exactly.
industry.
So now the decision, obviously, these are very expensive propositions. So the decision that you must have investment in basic industries, heavy industries. Number two, that heavy industries must largely be in the public sector. Tata Steel was already there from before independence. But if you see the investments that are made, and these are very heavy investments, private sector did not have that kind of resources at that time,
right,
even to go into it. Secondly, Nehru also believed that the crucial sectors should be state-owned, public-owned, so that they are not, they cannot be manipulated. Pricing, this, that. So this was again a very conscious decision. Now, how did he go about implementing it? Now, again, here the policy, in a sense, the non-aligned policy comes into play here also. The different steel plants are set up with collaborations with different countries. One is set up with collaboration with the Soviet Union, another one is set up with collaboration with UK, another one with the US, like that. So you spread, you don't become dependent even for that on any one country. Suppose your relations go bad
Right.
They stop supplying you the, technology and the manpower and all that you need. Then at
Right.
least you won't be dependent on them. You won't starve.
Hmm.
Similarly, our policy of defense purchases, for example, we
Right.
followed the same policy of diversification.
Hmm.
We would buy some weapons from here, some from here, some from there, some from there, till we start producing ourselves also. But so that we don't become dependent on any one country.
Right. So our options are open.
So our options remain open. Right. And so here in this heavy industry decision, again, this was very much something that was debated, very strongly debated at that time. Because after all, we didn't have endless resources. We were a poor country with limited resources. We did not want to become dependent on foreign aid.
Hmm.
That was also
That
very
was also
important.
another of Nehru's.
Aid would be tied.
Hmm.
They would want you to do it in this way and that way. So I think but we can see in the long run the benefits of that.
Hmm.
We were able to lay a solid base for industrialization, which by making these investments at that time. Similarly, I think the investments that were made in institutions, you just mentioned
IITs, IIMs.
Exactly. The setting up of the IITs, the setting up of the whole space research organizations, nuclear research, all
Bhava Atomic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The scientific research establishment, your whole CSIR network, for example, it's huge.
Right.
Right. Now, all that was set up in the 50s. The All India Institute of Medical Sciences, not just a hospital, but a research institution where primary research would be carried on. See, the whole idea that we are not only going to consume the research that the rest of the world is doing, but we must have our own knowledge production. Whether it is in science or whether it is engineering or whether it is social sciences, independent knowledge production has to be our objective. And right from the beginning, we invest in that.
Right.
Okay? So that we are seeing the benefits of that when you talk of the whole IT revolution and you say now India is known by its computer engineers and, the IT sector and this and that and the other.
So by the mid-90s,
the knowledge revolution, the knowledge revolution could not have happened if you had not set up these institutional structures.
Right.
Yeah, even today it is your IIT graduates that are wanted. It is your IIM graduates that are wanted. Even you come to other things. The Film Institute.
Exactly. Yeah.
The film archives. I mean, even in the arts.
So even in the department
all the academies.
So yeah. So even in art sector.
Yeah, because these are the things through which you build and you sustain an independent intellectual and cultural life in the country. So again, you are not just copybooks of somebody else. Okay. So all this is important. The Sahitya Academies, all the cultural, the National School of Drama, everything, So
all of that was, even NSD was established during the 50s. All of these were.
Yes, it was all during that period. Now, so it was very important. Even the basic work for Green Revolution was also done towards the end of Nehru's tenure. The ideas were already there. They were then implemented partly by Lal Bahadur Shastri, but he wasn't there very long, and then by Indira Gandhi. I think when you say what was his dream,
Yeah.
Again, there is a misconception.
I think that is coming through. It is coming through from this conversation.
There is a misconception that he did not put enough emphasis on primary education.
Okay.
On school education, and went in only for these higher education, universities and research establishment. That is not true. Right. If you look at the data, there was tremendous expansion in education at the basic I mean, the school education, primary and secondary during that period. And there was a building up of what not public schools in the sense that we understand them, but a public education system,
Government
a
schools.
education system.
Government schools, right?
Yes, there was a tremendous expansion of government schools that took place during that period. In fact, the picture that we have now of a system which has, in a sense, became so bad that people started leaving it and started going to the private
schools.
That was not there in the Nehruvian period. Some of your most famous people studied in government schools at that time. It was considered quite okay to study there were very good government schools.
Right.
And expansion in the rural areas also. Of course, we were short of resources, so everything could not be done at once. You could not have, compulsory primary education and all that because we didn't have those resources.
Yeah.
But that it was neglected is a wrong notion about the Nehruvian period.
Right. So soft power, heavy industries, our art and education, which we would call the soft power. I mean, I frankly cannot think of any areas where Nehru did not have a thought and did not have a vision and did not have a planning. And like I in the beginning asked, it seems to me that the vision I was looking for that Nehru had is sort of coming through from this conversation. It is kind of, all these institutions and all these investments
and democracy. I mean, we can't talk about his vision without forefronting democracy. I think his whole understanding of how you develop, how you do all this, you do it by building consensus across political parties, across classes, across different political ideologies, and you do it through a democratic structure. You do it through parliament. You do it through the community institutions at the lower levels. His whole effort at building up this community development system, going down to the block level, that was all inspired by a notion of democracy.
So it was not just his dream being top down.
No, he did not believe that this could happen through one strong man at the top and a bureaucratic system.
Right.
Of course, the bureaucracy had to play a role. He even had the Nehruvian bureaucracy was also quite different. They had developmental ideology,
right?
That they had to contribute and all that. Of course, there was some old type bureaucracy also persisted. I'm not saying that everything was radical and beautiful and worked. There were a lot of tensions, but his perspective of commitment to the democratic method, he was willing often to go slow, to retreat in order to carry people with him.
Often to bring everybody in confidence.
Not going fast enough.
Right.
You are so powerful. If you say it, people will follow. But he would not do it that way.
Unless he takes everybody in confidence.
Yes, yes. Convincing people, taking them along.
Which would probably take time. And
which takes time.
What we today witness in the last 7 years that we have witnessed with someone who is maybe, after 3 decades, we have another very powerful prime minister who has all the power in his hand. And if he wants, he can just bulldoze all his plans and visions for the nation, which is what we probably are seeing, that just because he has the power, he can, bulldoze it without taking the opposition.
I wouldn't use the word vision. Plan is one thing, vision is another.
Yeah, that's true. Plan is one thing and vision is another. Yeah, but let's not go there. So the thing is that, I have to ask this question, that will you, in your assessment, would there be no, I mean, can't we find out any flaw in Nehru's planning? I mean, if I don't discuss that question, it would seem like we are trying to just, you know, say one narrative. I mean, sure, there are various, it's not. I mean, you can't be perfect. I mean, so what would you think would there are one thing that you think could have been done in a different way, or maybe we misunderstood, or maybe miscalculated, or something like that. People talk about the Kashmir issue, or I don't know. You would be
See, specific issues one can always talk about.
right.
One can always disagree with a particular policy, or there can be not one, two, there can be 3 or 4 points of view about how you handle a particular problem.
Exactly.
So that is a different thing. I would like to say, in a broader sense, when you said that what you think would be we could look at the weaknesses in the whole Nehruvian approach, I would say that the weakness, it's not an individual failing. It's a question of the circumstances in which one is placed. I think one of the weaknesses that emerged of the Nehruvian model, he didn't want it that way, but he did have the instruments, and he could not build those instruments, was how to actually carry the whole of what he wanted to do to the people.
Okay.
Right. Now, here I would like to just go back a bit into history. I think during the period of the freedom struggle, Nehru's role was that much more that of a mobilizer. He was the one, for example, in the 1936-37, the first nationwide elections that took place in India, where provincial governments were formed, popular ministries, Indian governments were formed under the British. He went all over the country, mobilizing for that election. He went into villages. He traveled some 35,000 kilometers by every possible mode of transport, inspiring people, giving speeches, talking to them. His role was not that of organizing the party machinery. He was never a party builder. There were others who were specialists in that, Sardar Patel being one. Okay, Nehru was never an organizer at the party level. He was the person who mobilized ideologically level. Okay, and now Gandhiji also died after independence. Sardar Patel died. Those people who were powerful in the party often tended to be, now Congress party was also an amalgam of different ideologies.
Absolutely.
They were not all Nehruvians.
Right.
There were also many people who were more conservative, who didn't necessarily think that the way Nehru wanted to go in a socialist direction was the right way. And party organization was generally in the hands of the more conservative people. We know that in the early 50s, he even fought elections for the party presidentship, and for 3 years he remained the president when he fought with Purushottam Das Tandon, because in order to stave off a threat from conservative forces. After that, there were other people who were party presidents and all that. But the party organizations, that was not his forte.
Okay.
Right. The kind of people on whom he would rely for popular mobilization around the kind of ideas that he had, right? For land reform, for taking all these ideas, for the panchayat system to really begin to flourish. Those people would be more on the left of the Congress. And many of them were people who separated from the Congress, the Congress Socialist, the Socialist Party, the PSP after independence. In a way, those people with whom he had ideological affinity, many of them left the Congress.
Right.
they were the ones, and they were the kind of forces who would he be his natural allies. So when we say many things which he wanted to do, for example, land reform, would have got slower than he wanted, would be because you cannot implement land reform through bureaucrats. To implement land reform, you need a movement on the ground.
On the ground, which was
You need cadre on the ground who will actually implement the law, who will see that in the village it is the poorer people who benefit from the law and not the richer people who take away the benefit of the law. How much kind of bureaucracy do, and bureaucracy will never be motivated like that.
Exactly.
Now, this is where I think Nehru faced continually a problem.
A challenge.
Because those who were ideologically with him, organizationally left. He kept asking them to come back, as you know. He kept begging Jayaprakash Narayan, please come back. And others.
He did.
But
okay.
So now, in a sense,
actually, we do not know that. I mean, with this sort of
the party machinery which was there more at the level of the party, it was more the conservative elements which were powerful, and they were not interested in implementing things like land reform.
Right.
So I think we have to look at this structural issue. And now to expect that Nehru could also become a party organizer, is perhaps expecting too much.
Too much, yeah.
But this remained therefore a weakness. Terms that the model of change, internally, the model of change that he wanted, the rapidity with which he wanted it, and, the kind of class transformations that he wanted could not happen to the extent
that he wanted because of the organizational weaknesses.
Yes,
I think that is, and I think that is a weakness that still continues in the Congress party. It's a weakness.
I think Indira Gandhi faced the same issues after the split in the Congress. The Congress organization basically went with the Congress and she was left in a sense without a party.
Right. Yeah.
We say that under Indira Gandhi the party was not built up and all, but that was partly because, and that's why she relied more and more on her own personality.
Yeah.
To get the votes.
True.
Rather than
she had to.
And you're right. I mean, that's outside the purview of this discussion.
Yeah,
but
of course, that's outside the purview of this discussion.
Remains a weakness.
We could have that conversation another day, and it's always, but coming to also, somewhat related to this is also this communication, media, the role of media. What do you think the media's role have been in the last, in both the formal and the informal have been late tarnishing Nehru's image, and there is a lot of information, there is a lot of misinformation about Nehru on internet and completely unreliable informal sources. But
that is one of the biggest problem with social media is that,
But also mainstream media has also done a lot of tarnishing of Nehru's image. I mean, what do you think?
But in a different way.
Okay.
At least I would say that as far as if you talk of, newspapers and all that, they would not be publishing straight falsehoods and scurrilous stuff, Whereas social media is full of, what can I say? I mean, completely imaginary, completely distorted. It's not even distorted. Distorted is when there is something and you twist it.
Yeah.
But if you imagine a scenario, you create a completely new story. You create a story that he was a Muslim. You create a story that his mother was a prostitute. You create a story that, he was
absolutely despicable. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, if you see some of that stuff, where is it coming from? His grandfather was a Muslim. I mean, his whole lineage is completely created, I mean, where do you tell me how can you argue with such stuff? You can
Hmm.
only say that this is complete garbage, and has to be discarded. How can I start saying, no, he was a Hindu, his mother was so and so, his grandfather was not a Muslim? I mean, it's so ridiculous.
Yeah. And you
Well
can't,
known,
how do you even challenge the
something,
narrative? Like, how do you even,
when some things are chronicled, they are there in black and white, right? There is no doubt about them at all, no?
hmm,
And yet there is complete falsehood that is
being
spread.
spread? Yeah.
It's something very different from a critical interpretation.
Hmm.
It's one thing to argue about Kashmir or China or this or that and criticize Nehru as much as you want to and say that he was naive, he was this, he didn't understand, he loved Krishna Menon too much. You can say whatever you like, but at least that is within the realm of possibility. See, I don't know. I'm not an expert on social media. I know that there are a lot of sites which now do examine and come out with what is false
Fact
news,
checks. Yeah.
fact
Fact
checks,
checks
like
are
that.
now being
I
done.
don't know how much of that actually reaches the people who have already consumed the.
Yeah. Not only they have already consumed, what is also troubling is
Exactly.
that what is, I mean, we're living in a post-truth world today where people just don't want to believe anything else. I mean, once they are convinced that this is what I want to believe, then
Mm.
they will believe in that, no matter how much proof you give them. It's just the
Mm.
kind of very bizarre post-truth world that we are
I
living in.
saw these photographs. I was horrified. There was these photographs which were supposed to prove that he was a womanizer,
Yeah, that has been.
hugging different women, and all that. And I looked at those photographs. One was he was hugging his sister, Vijayalakshmi Pandit, and she's such a well-known figure,
Mm.
but people today may not recognize her. Another one, it was his niece. I mean, things
Yeah.
like that. Take photographs where of him with his family members, and then you want to prove that he was a womanizer, he was a debauch. All kinds of stories are spread about him. I mean, this is complete nonsense.
The thing is that, what seems to me the interesting thing in this is that how systematic the campaign has been to destroy his legacy and his personality and his character. That these photographs have been selected from various parts of history which probably goes back 70, 80, 90 years of time, and they have been picked up. More than that, it's probably like 100-year-old moments in history that have been picked up and put together just to say that he was a womanizer, whereas these are, so it just shows that the whoever thought of doing this is coming with such a vicious agenda to destroy somebody's character and legacy. That is what. And I don't know why Congress party or the family, Nehru's family, has never tried to sort of reclaim the narrative or challenge these narratives, or not try to, either try to get these sites pulled down, maybe take some legal action. I don't know what is that reason, but it has not happened. uh,
I don't know enough about how these things are handled, to be able to say how do
yeah,
you
yeah.
how there must be ways of countering, I'm
There
sure.
are always some ways. uh, One can write to these, like Google or Facebook. One can write to these big giants, tech giants, to sort of, take down false.
At a different level, what seems to me is that the purpose of this creation of these kind of
The
images about
purpose.
him,
Yeah.
the basic purpose is to show that he was uh, a westernized person, alienated from Indian culture.
Hmm.
And all this rest is supposed to feed into that.
Feed into that.
The
Yeah.
image that is sought to be created of Nehru is somebody who didn't know India.
Yeah.
Bharatiya, he was devoid of Bharatiya
Yeah.
Sanskrit.
Not Sanskrit,
Anything
not
about
Sanskari enough.
exactly.
Yeah.
Now the thing is that again, I mean, you have to just read the discovery of India to see how deep was his knowledge of
Knowledge.
Indian culture,
Exactly.
Indian mythology, Indian classical literature, ancient history, how much he admired ancient Indian culture, of course, with criticisms of what was wrong. But his understanding of the epics, his understanding, it's beginning right from the Indus Valley civilization, the Vedic period, his understanding of Vivekanand, for example, he admired Vivekanand. His whole, the love he has for Indian culture and history, including of the so-called, which they call Hindu period,
Mm.
And of course of the Buddha.
Mm.
But even of the Vedic period and other periods of ancient Indian history is enormous, and it is such a distortion to project him as somebody who neither knew anything,
Yeah.
was not educated. I challenge any of our present people who are in power, to have even a minuscule fraction of his knowledge, the time and energy he had spent to learn about that culture, including, you see what he has quoted from the Upanishads in Discovery of India,
Mm.
the hymns of the Upanishads, how he admires them, and it is amazing. See, only it's such easily available material.
That kind of brings me to my next question: is how do we then tell the next generation of who really Nehru was?
We made a tryst with destiny, and now the time comes.
What are the ways forward? Like, for example, I wanted to ask you, what would be the few books that you would recommend of Nehru's books? Also, Lenny, how did you get to know Nehru, and how can we all get to know Nehru? How was your journey, your personal journey of knowing Nehru, and some of the books that you would recommend?
Nehru's own books are so accessible that first of all, I would recommend that they are so easy to read,
Okay.
and they are beautifully written.
Hmm.
And so I would suggest that anybody wanting to get to know anything about Nehru, first and foremost, you read Discovery of India. Because Discovery of India is the entire Indian history, right up till the 1940s,
Hmm.
including Quit India movement.
Okay.
Only thing it doesn't have is 45-47 period of transfer of power, because it was written in 44. So till that period, it's a complete record of Indian history, and it gives you Nehru's views in great detail. There's some personal, it talks about his own life also in it. And but it is a fantastic way of getting to know what he thought, what were his views on various things, and also learning about your own culture and history. I don't think there is a better introduction to Indian culture, including ancient Indian culture, Hindu culture, than Discovery of India. I challenge anyone to give me a better and more accessible work.
Wonderful.
Secondly, I would say for Indian history, the autobiography also very good, because that gives you a more detailed account of the struggle for freedom, particularly from 1918-19 till 1934, that period, the Gandhi period. When Gandhi first came, it is in much more detail, because that is the period he covers in his autobiography. And of course, Glimpses of World History is again a fantastic introduction to world history. So his three basic works, I think, still remain classics.
3 basic
which
works, right?
you try to read, but Discovery certainly is, I would say, the first book that you should read.
Hmm.
But if you want to go into a little more depth, then I think autobiography is also so interesting because it also gives you a flavor of India's struggle for freedom. In that book, he's constantly arguing with Gandhiji. All the time, he's criticizing him. He's saying, I don't agree with this, I don't agree with that, It shows what kind of freedom struggle we had.
Hmm.
People who were the closest comrades, they could disagree with each other so strongly, and yet work together. That was democracy. Their commitment to democracy was so strong, even within themselves, inner party democracy. You see how it is that inner party democracy which later becomes, at the level of the Indian nation and state after independence. It is that practice within the Congress which becomes then generalized. It is because they had grown up in that. They had never tried to suppress each other's voices,
Diversity
but argued ferociously, with each other, and yet worked together. So consensus building, which I talked about, was not some that Nehru had, suddenly thought that this is how you run a country. It was that 30 years experience of working in the Indian struggle for freedom, in the Indian National Congress, where the way they resolved that went forward was through discussion, debate,
dialogues,
consensus building, difference, again, working together. It was a constant process. So he had practice of that. And he had colleagues who were stalwarts, who were no less than him. So he was used to, being an equal with others, not used to being big boss. Rajaji,
right.
C. Rajagopalachari, what a giant of an intellectual. Maulana Azad, such a giant of an intellectual. When Nehru says in his Discovery of India, in his introduction, he writes it in jail, He was in Ahmednagar Fort for Quit India movement. 3 years he was in jail. And he wrote this book in 5 months.
5 months.
In jail. With only access to whatever books and all, had managed to get from outside. That's all. Wrote it longhand, and
there must be the manuscript somewhere.
Yeah, it's in the Nehru Memorial Museum.
It's in the library. Okay.
It's beautiful. You should see it. He hardly crosses out anything.
Wow.
Beautiful handwriting. It's a fantastic thing to just see that manuscript, And he says in the introduction, I'm so lucky that during my jail term, I have had the pleasure of interacting, because they were all there. Gandhiji was separate, but many working committee members, they were all there together. Maulana Azad, he shared a cell with Maulana Azad. Huh? They shared a room in the jail.
Okay. Wow.
As he said, they could hear each other snore. Gobind Ballabh Pant, he says, was a very erudite companion. Then he mentions Asaf Ali.
Right.
Amazing. The Acharya Narendra Dev was also there in the jail.
Yeah.
So he mentioned these 4
and
or 5
he mentioned them all in the book.
Introduction. As people from whom he benefited.
He has learned. Yeah.
Yeah. And about Maulana Azad, he says that his intellect and his knowledge was so impressive and even intimidating, he says.
Mm-hmm.
And of the classics and everything. So, it was a different world. When we talk in these terms and all that, you just feel you are completely out of it. You have no idea about what you're talking about,
Yeah. And that's why it kind of, personally, it also sort of, pains me that 75 years after the independence, we are still trying to understand this person. Whereas to my mind, he should have already been established and already been that luminary in the sky. I mean, that we knew, but it seems that we have ourselves not not valued enough, not understood him enough. I don't know where we have gone
So,
wrong.
it also changes from generation to generation. I would say that earlier generations after independence, I mean, Nehru's books, for example, Discovery of India, Autobiography, Glimpses, these would be in educated households, they would be
They would
necessary,
be, yeah, right.
and children would grow up reading them.
But I guess things change from 90s on. I am an 80s kid. I am an 80s child. But if you ask me about the last 20 years, I think that, I don't know, somewhere we kind of lost him. And also, that's why I also wanted to ask one more thing, is that uh, like, these leaders like Martin Luther King, Gandhi, they are much bigger than just political leaders. They are also people whose books we read, people whose quotes we follow, who become part of the pop culture. They become part of that entire, a gamut of knowledge. Where does Nehru stand in that? I mean, is Nehru also studied by international academics? Is Nehru's work studied academically? Uh,
Oh, yes. Yes. Well, not, of course, Gandhi's thought is
Gan-
much,
yeah,
I would say that, because but you know what? You would be surprised how much Nehru is known in Africa and West Asia.
hmm,
You know? I remember in once Simon Peres had come to JNU.
okay.
I'm talking of about 20 years ago. And we were, he gave a little talk and we were discussing and all that. And he said, we grew up on Nehru. He was our hero.
Wow, that's
For
amazing.
a whole generation, he was the hero of the non-Western world. I mean, despite what happened with China and all that, we were very pleasantly surprised on a visit to China about 10 years ago that the scholars over there, you know, um, they had a very different view of Nehru. They
Chinese
didn't have
scholars.
the official view of Nehru at all.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's
Some
interesting.
of them were the older scholars, they were great admirers of Nehru.
Right.
You know? He had such love for China, such admiration for China.
Nehru.
Historically, yes,
Yeah, okay.
and he really had hoped that, after the end of colonialism, because these were the two big countries of Asia, that it would be a joint kind of effort
Power,
to
joint power. Yeah.
take Asia out of the underdevelopment, the poverty, the backwardness. He saw how much he supported China in the UN, for example.
Hmm. I think we should have another conversation on just on China and Nehru and the war and everything that happened around that. Uh, of course, this would be too long a conversation if we delve into that. But ma'am, I have one last question. The role of Nehru Memorial Library in what is the role of in knowing Nehru, in carrying forward his legacy, the kind of activities that has been happening? Can you just briefly tell us about the Nehru Memorial?
The Nehru Memorial Museum and Library was set up in memory of Jawaharlal Nehru to take forward his ideals. Therefore, the library was set up as a library of modern Indian history with a special focus on the history of the freedom struggle. Okay, so that was how it was envisaged. It has grown into now a very good social science library. It has lots of works on all social sciences, not only on history, but the original objective was to focus on modern Indian history and freedom struggle. Therefore, it has very large sections on Gandhi, Nehru, there's a whole Gandhiana, Nehruana, I mean, the books everywhere. Then also it was meant to be the focus being on freedom struggle again. An archive, a non-official archive that, for example, National Archives is there, but archives is supposed to have government records. As and when government records become open, they are supposed to shift to the National
Archive. Right.
Of course, National Archives also acquires some other private papers, collections, like they have the Rajendra Prasad papers, which is a huge collection. Then there was this huge project on history of freedom movement by Tara Chand after independence.
Okay.
Official history. So huge collection of material which was there for that project, that is in National Archives. But basically, National Archives is meant for the government repository. The idea here was to collect the private papers and of individuals as well as papers of institutions, parties. So the Congress archives is in the Nehru Memorial.
Okay.
The AICC papers, they are called. So that entire historical record of the Congress party is held by the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library in its archival section, because it is meant to be a record to study the freedom struggle. So All India Statespeople Conference, their papers are there. Hindu Mahasabha papers are there. Okay. So lots of party papers are there. And also huge number of papers of individuals.
Okay.
Both, but then since it was set up after independence, it also acquired papers of people who were important in the period of Nehru's prime ministership also, post-independence, because you could not confine it to just before independence. So it collected a large number. It also had an oral history section, where it has a very valuable archive of, because it started, in the 60s. So a lot of people were alive then, who were contemporaries of Nehru and participants in the freedom struggle.
So audio visuals are also there, or?
Those are basically audio.
Okay.
Because at that time,
visuals were not there.
Audio. Later, some audio-visual recordings were done during my time.
But testimonies, oral testimonies, and those kind of things.
Recordings, and those are then transcribed.
Okay.
Those are
right.
And of course, the other thing is it has a huge collection of newspapers.
Okay.
Of the pre-independence period. They have some newspapers even going back to middle of 19th century. And certainly all the major newspapers that you need to write about the freedom struggle and the colonial period. So some newspapers are not there, but it has a very large number of newspaper collection.
So,
okay.
Right.
So these are the basic, apart from the museum. Museum is of course there. I'm not talking about that. Everybody knows that museum part. But that was, no, see, museum also, let me point out, only 2 or 3 rooms are rooms kept as they were when Nehru was living.
Okay.
His bedroom, his sitting room, and his office. Office also recreated from what it was in the External Affairs Ministry and all that, Prime Minister's office. Rest of the building is actually an exhibition on the struggle for freedom.
Okay.
With only a small part being the story of Nehru in the struggle for freedom.
So it is not just about Nehru at all.
Nehru comes in with there's some photographs and all of the childhood and this and that, and then they join into the bigger story.
Right.
So the basic thing which is spread over, maybe 20 rooms is all the story of the struggle for freedom.
Right.
Through photographs, texts, images, and all that.
So in today's, if I understand it correctly, in today's age of post-truth, if the young generation who are reading only WhatsApp If they have any doubt whether Nehru ever visited Bhagat Singh in the jail or not, they can go to the library and they can find out the newspapers and they can read. They can find out the truth on their own. I mean, all of these knowledge and all of these history of our freedom struggle is there in the library and they can find out. I mean, that is important too.
Yes, and one of the things which was started during the period when I was there was a whole digitization initiative.
Okay.
So a lot of the material which I'm talking about is also now available in digitized form. Not all of it.
Online. Are they also available online?
So people can access it online.
Can access online. Right. Right. So that's amazing. Fantastic, ma'am. Thank you so much for speaking.